Good afternoon. Welcome to our COVID-19 Powered Lunch webinar series. Twice weekly, we bring you legislative updates related to the coronavirus pandemic that can affect you and your business. As a reminder, my name is Erin Spiwak, and I'm the moderator for the series. Today with me, I have Mike Sibley, a partner with James Moore & Company, to discuss any new legislative updates or thoughts around the PPP loan program. Mike, I know one of the big things that they had stressed in the law was that if there was any part of the loan that was forgiven, it would not be includable in gross income. And then the IRS recently came out and said that is true. However, if you have any expenses paid by that loan, then and that loan forgiveness, you can't deduct the expenses against this income. But I know Congress hasn't been happy about that. Can you explain a little bit more what's going on there?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Erin. Yeah, under the senators, there are senators who have introduced legislation to reverse the course on the IRS, but stepping back, it was always their intent that this loan would be forgiven and would not be includable in taxable income. And so clearly, it seemed clear to everyone else that those expenses would still be deductible. Because if you said, no, those expenses aren't deductible to the extent that they're paid by a forgivable loan, which effectively became a federal grant, then you've almost negated the intent of Congress when they designed that legislation. And initially it came out that letters were being written to the IRS saying you need to reverse course. The IRS said they would take that under consideration. However, as you mentioned, Congress has not been happy with the results, and they want to make sure that this actually goes through the way that their intent was. And many have come out, and this seems to be a bipartisan approach. And so they are going to introduce this. I think ultimately it's going to get passed. If you think about it from a liquidity standpoint, allowing these expenses to continue to be deductible will provide relief down the road. This is not something that's going to end in an 8-week time frame. Businesses don't just turn it on and turn it off to get things going again. It takes ramp up time. There's going to be a lot of hardship for a lot of businesses for a long time. There's still many, even though states are starting to open back up, Florida's starting to open back up a little bit. This is going to be something that's going to be long lasting. There are businesses now who are going through their backlog and are doing okay, but they're going to hurt later on when they don't have the ability to generate business development activities right now, new proposals, things like that. So I think this is a good move. I think it's something that's going to pass. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see, and in future updates, we'll be able to give a little bit more definitive answer on that, but I do think this is moving in the right direction.
That's really good. Congress also has put a lot of pressure on the SBA related to giving out guidance on the forgiveness piece, and because we've been anxiously awaiting that, and every week I feel like we say, oh, we're going to be getting that this week, and we still don't see anything. So can you tell us a little bit about what Congress is trying to impose on the SBA related to how to calculate this loan forgiveness, as some companies are already 4 weeks into it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. Here we are, what was it, April 3rd, when people could start applying, and then a few days later, as early as a few days later, businesses started receiving the funding, and now we're a month and a half into this. It's hard to believe that we're 6 weeks into this program. And at first, obviously, there was the angst over how do I get this money? How do I get my application in? What banks do it? So that created the anxiety. Now it's shifted to, okay, I've gotten this money. How do I make sure I properly apply it? And when you read the CARES Act itself, it was pretty simple. It seemed to be designed to be simple. Here's the money. We want you to pay payroll and some overhead expenses, and it'll be forgivable. And then, the SBA started coming out with rules on 75% of it has to be payroll, and no more than 25% can be overhead, and some other regulations. And of course, as you mentioned, they still haven't come out with any guidance on how to do some of these calculations, and that's creating a significant amount of anxiety. So knowing that there is pressure from Congress to simplify these rules, to make it simpler. In fact, they've even heard some rumors of maybe extending it out, allowing it to move a little bit further out, because 8 weeks clearly wasn't enough. I mean, obviously Congress was trying to do something. They were trying to act quickly, trying to get money out there. And, you know, as this thing is extending on and continuing on, there needs to be some more consideration of this. And of course, taking businesses and having them, these businesses need to worry about paying their payroll, trying to keep operations going to the extent that they can, not worried about how we calculate complicated forgiveness calculation. And so, you know, there is that pressure to try to relieve that. And I actually think that's probably why we're not getting the guidance that we're waiting for. Is I think they're trying to take all this into consideration and come up with something. So in the meantime, obviously, we're trying to move forward under what we think might be, at least as the safe way to move forward, but there's still a lot of questions that we're waiting on. The hope is, though, with pressure from Congress, that this will get a more simplified approach to it.
No, definitely, hopefully so, and hopefully really, really soon. Like I said, I have clients who are in week 4, almost week 5, and, you know, just going along and trying to be as diligent as they can in how they're spending the money. And I don't think that a lot of businesses are not out there to take advantage of it. They just want to make sure they document it correctly, and that they're able to maximize forgiveness so they don't have to have a lot of debt to pay back when they're just trying to keep their people employed. So let's talk about something that kind of they extended last week, where they said, hey, if you think you've got the money because of economic uncertainty, and now you decided or determined that that is not applicable for your business, you have until May 7th to return the money. Pretty much no questions asked, goes back into the pot, everything is clear. And last week they came out and said, hey, we're going to actually give you till May 14th. We don't feel like May 7th was a fair date, so you can still return the money. So we've had a lot of people call with the comments by Mnuchin and the Department of Treasury related to criminal and fraud charges if you took the money and you shouldn't have. And I know there's been a lot of big concerns. Can we talk about how, and we talked about this a little bit before, but maybe how you can document or determine your economic uncertainty and the loan documents you signed that you don't need to return the money?
Yes, that's a great question. It's when all of this has been coming out, you know, between questions on how do we calculate forgiveness and wait a second, forget about forgiveness. Do I even qualify to get this loan? My business is down 25, 50%. I don't know if I qualify even under those circumstances. It's like, wait a second, I think let's back up and let's really kind of think through this. And there are some businesses, obviously, who may not be as impacted, but have a great deal of uncertainty due to other reasons. When this came out, it was obviously as a response to a lot of what you heard in the media about some of these publicly traded companies and these very large companies getting these loans. When the CARES Act was passed, there was no test about what economic uncertainty meant. And still to this day, there's no test as to what that means. Certainly when the CARES Act was passed, Treasury came out and said there's no requirement to look elsewhere for capital. And then they came out and said, well, if you have access to capital, you need to have gone through that first. Of course, there's still no definition as to what that means, which is probably a good thing from a gray area. Without a definition, that gives rise to judgment, which comes up to the point of, well, document your judgment. How do you meet that economic uncertainty? What is going on in your industry? What is going on in your business? What's happening with your customers? What's happening with your collections? How are your projections looking? Are you projecting your revenues are going to be down? You probably already have felt collection issues from customers. As I mentioned about your industry, well, document. There's a lot of things. For example, real estate and home sales going significantly down. Clearly, the restaurant industry. You're seeing what's happening with hotels, retail, salons. There's all sorts of, you know, all these different industries that are impacted. And those are the ones that are less subtle. Then there's the maybe more subtle ones where you are seeing your backlog dry up. Customer payments are being delayed. And, you know, so go through all of these thought processes and document what your economic uncertainty is to make sure that that judgment stands still. Ultimately, obviously, this becomes somewhat of a legal issue. They have put out the threat of criminal, potential criminal charges for misleading on the uncertainty principle and things like that, ultimately talk to your attorney. This becomes a legal question. I know there's already lawsuits against the SBA on this particular issue because they felt that they're changing the rules after the fact, and doesn't meet what the intent of Congress was. Really, it seemed at the beginning the intent of Congress was this is effectively going to be a grant to keep people on payroll to help businesses through this uncertain time. There are some businesses who are doing well. If you're doing very well, your revenues are as strong as ever, stronger, collections aren't an issue, and you get the loan. Perhaps it wasn't correct for you to get the loan. And by extending the date to the 14th, it does give you an opportunity to look through that. But before you go through that process, document your thought process and talk to your attorney and see what they think about your judgment in this.
Right. Well, and it sounds like you almost have to have a business plan for the next few months to a year to determine that economic uncertainty. So we ask clients to kind of look beyond this 8-week period and say, hey, what's it going to look like in July, August, September? Look down the road. Is there a reason that you needed the money today so that you can keep people on payroll even longer? As you said, if businesses start to have more issues down the road as kind of the I don't know, like the chain reaction to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you may not be affected today in this 8 weeks, but you could be affected in August, September, October, and people can kind of start to see how that's working now.
Well, and that's a great point. I think we've talked about that in earlier series where there's many businesses that are actually more worried about the third and fourth quarter because of that. I mentioned earlier that backlog that they're working through, and as they work through that, the PPP is actually providing somewhat of a buffer because I've been talking to those business owners, and I'm sure you have too, where they would actually already start letting people go and putting them on either furloughs or just laying off to start building that cash reserve, knowing that they're going to hurt. They're not bringing in the new backlog that they were before, and so this is allowing them to keep a buffer to make sure they can keep people employed now and hopefully through their rough spots as hopefully the economy gets back going again and they can rebuild that backlog. So to me, it's critical that you really look at, and of course you mentioned a business plan. Now's the time. If you didn't have a business plan before, you certainly need one, and you need to have projections in place. You need to know how you're going to get through this difficult time. Mm-hmm. But I think it does go beyond 8 weeks. I feel like, when you're listening to what members of Congress are saying, they are understanding that this is not just going to be a short-term window here, that this is going to take a long time for businesses to recover. So I do think you got to take that in consideration as part of this whole uncertainty.
Yeah, I know that there's been talk in Congress about even extending that 8-week, which you mentioned earlier, to even a 16-week period, because they see the need for flexibility. And who knows, I'm sure we could read plenty of articles of where the 8 weeks originally came from, but we can certainly see that this is going to extend into quarter 3, quarter 4 for sure, affecting people's individual and business needs.
Yeah, well, I heard some great ideas. Even you mentioned the 16-week. I heard some great ideas where they're bringing people back maybe to work. Take a restaurant where you're hearing about this 25% or 50% capacity eventually. They'd like to use that money, but as you mentioned, over a longer period of time, so they can slowly bring people back and get people working. Some people are still on unemployment. Of course, one of the other rules that came out that's been discussed in the past was, well, if that person doesn't want to come back from unemployment, you can issue them a letter of offering them to come back, and if they reject it, then they won't count against you in the forgiveness piece of things. So the idea would be that if you extended this out, they could continue to collect unemployment, but then as the business ramps up, then you have the cash flow from the PPP to help offset that as you build business. So you need working capital before the business gets there so you can properly operate.
Yeah, and I mean, I know we refer to the restaurant and travel industry a lot because it's obviously the most hard hit and the most, hey, you have to close your doors today and not have revenue, or only you have takeout, so you're reduced to 25% or less of your staff. But again, it goes back to that whole chain reaction of that we forget one of the biggest concerns with the economy was when before even the U.S. I think really went into a lockdown effect and realized we were already seeing supply chain issues from things coming from Asia, particularly China, that were slowing down manufacturing, building homes, things of that nature. And that hasn't gone away. It's just been quietened, right? So that's why we know that in quarter three, quarter four, we still might have subsequent issues that are going on with this. And one of the things they talked about was the ability to be able to go and get other capital. And so I've had clients say, well, I do have this line of credit. It renews every year with the bank. Is that access to capital that I should be using? It's a really good question. But you also have to consider, what is the bank going to renew your line of credit? Are they going to reduce it? I know the banks, rightfully so, have become a little bit more stringent on their lending policies by making people document, hey, let me see how my business is doing because of the pandemic. They don't want to have a lot of bad loans out there anyways.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. So you've got a line of credit potentially, but there's a higher interest rate on this line of credit.
Yeah.
So you're drawing on a line of credit to fund operations that may not even be there right now. And you're right, it is more, manufacturers have shut down to some degree. Some have been very innovative and been able to help with making the masks and some of these other medical equipment pieces, and that's great. Not all of them could do that. Contractors have been slowing down as no new projects. Some industries, obviously, some are not. So you're seeing manufacturers, contractors, entities in the real estate market. There's just all sorts of industries affected by it. And I do have concern about this idea that if you're paying payroll and your operations are significantly reduced, or your cash flows are significantly reduced, and you're funding this. You're paying a higher interest rate, and you're putting yourself into deeper debt. And I'm not sure, with potentially no cash flows for a while now, I think that's going to really hurt businesses. And I think that's something that needs to be considered as part of your documentation about how detrimental this could be.
Right.
And of course, during this time, how easy has it been? Our banker friends who have done a great job with the PPP loans, who have really served well, been working very, very hard. I know there's been a lot of frustrations out there with banks, but you're talking about hundreds of thousands and millions of applications coming out. These guys have been working, try to get a loan during this time. It's not an easy thing to do when they're trying to process all these PPP on top of it. So there's just a lot of things I think that a business can document through their considerations, and I'm not sure that just having access to the line of credit alone is enough to say that you had proper access to capital.
No, I agree. All right, so let's pivot a little bit to talking about the process of documenting your loan forgiveness as we're coming up on 8 weeks for some people that haven't come out yet. And with the banks or the SBA, again, we've talked about that with the guidance on the loan forgiveness. But one of the questions we've had is, hey, how do I start to gather this documentation together that I'm going to need to turn over to the bank in order for them to determine what my loan forgiveness amount is? What is some of the things that we suggest?
Yeah, so I'm sure there's a lot of different ways to approach this, but the way I'm approaching it is the first thing when someone gets the funding is I ask them, let's project out your payroll for the next 8 weeks. Let's just see where we're going to be in regards to this 75%. So the loan requirements right now say you have to get 75% of the forgivable portion. It's got to be payroll related. And so let's figure out what is the 75%. So using a loan of $100,000 as an example, we've got to hit that $75,000 mark. And of course, that's your gross payroll, that's your healthcare costs, that's your profit sharing or your retirement plan costs, and your SUTA, all of that captured. And let's see how close we get to that 75%. Now, we've talked in the past, what other strategies can we use? Well, there's bonuses, there's commissions, there's things like that. There's not really been, again, there's not been any guidance to say what you can or can't do. Of course, some people are saying, well, some of my employees aren't coming back to work. We're putting some family members in to help with what operations. Is that okay? Hopefully, we don't exactly know if that's going to create any sort of red flags or not. But those are strategies that at some point, hopefully we'll have some guidance to say, yeah, that's okay. Because some of these quote bonuses are really going to be making up employees' wages that were lost. So if sales are down, commissions are probably down. If operations are down, overtime is probably down. And you want to make those employees whole. So, you do that through supplemental income or, bonuses, so to speak, to try to make that employee as whole as possible given the circumstance. So the first thing I do is say, project out, see where you're going to be. Let's look at our overhead costs just to get a sense. So that way we can start talking about some strategies. The second thing is, let's look at your FTE counts, your full-time equivalents. I've been using a 30-hour because that seems to be, from the DOL, the IRS, what that level is, but we don't have any guidance. It could be 40, it could be 30. I've been using 30 for now to say, okay, let's compare our full-time equivalents for the next 8 weeks, what we think we're going to have on payroll to the previous quarter, January and February 2020, and let's compare it back also to February 15, 2019 through June 30th, 2019, and let's see where we're at. Again, using a simple example of if you had 20 back then and you have 16 now, you're at 80%. That means you're going to be looking at a reduced forgiveness amount. But in theory, that might mean that you have less money to spend on payroll anyway. But we want to be able to take a look at that and just see where we're at. Of course, you can correct that. If you go from 16 to 20 by the end of June of 2020, at least as of this point, you can have that piece not part of the calculation. So in other words, if you went back up to 20, you get 100% again.
Right. And then of course, right? Like they kind of look at it like it never happened.
Exactly. Yeah, it's exactly it. And then of course, let's look at what are you paying your employees? Are you paying them less than you were before? And so, because if it goes below 25% for those below 100,000, then you will have again reduced forgiveness amount. So let's look at that and let's try to make them whole. Let's make, whether it's more commissions, overtime, whatever it might be, to make sure that they're whole so you don't have that issue and it's helping the employee at the same time. So the first thing I'm doing is going through those factors to make sure that we're going to be okay and see where we're at. Then comes the documentation side of things. And I'm probably going extra conservative in the most amount of documentation here, but what I am saying is as you pay a payroll, let's take a copy of that payroll side and let's file it in a folder with our support, and let's create a tracking mechanism, a spreadsheet of sorts to say, here's what we're paying. And let's go through and document our payroll. When we pay our utility bills, when we pay our rent or our mortgage interest, let's pull all that aside and let's create a file that really well organizes it as we go. And it can track it anyway, because it's going to track it in real time to see how they're going. That way, at the end of our 8-week period, when banks are ready to start going through this forgiveness component, then we can easily hand over a document or documents that support everything that we've spent our money on. I know there's been a lot of concern about what happens if it's not in a separate bank account, it's commingled with this one. Well, I mean, to me, it's really going to come down to the documentation that supports you have proper payroll, you have these utilities, you have the rent, all of those kind of things in place that will support that loan, and I think ultimately you'll be fine. Now, of course, we'll see if the guidance even gives anything specific as to what they're looking for, but to me, that creates a good trail for auditing this loan should, for the details, should anybody need to get down into that level of detail.
No, I think that's a really, really good point. And again, tracking it as you go is probably the easiest way, so you're not spending the time after the 8 weeks scrambling to put the documentation together. And like you said, it helps you keep track of what you spent the money on. But certainly, as we have additional guidance that'll come out or information, we'll pass that along so that people know exactly what to do. But again, at this point, I'm not losing hope, but I'm just saying we've been waiting a while. And so at this point, we just have to say, this is what we know today, and kind of document what you know and what you have. And as we get closer to your 8 weeks from the time that you got the loan, we'll figure out what we need to do, right?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I'm hopeful that they're going to come out with something more simplified than what we're thinking. I mean, it could happen, right? Who knows? At least that seems like the intent of Congress at this point. So hopefully that'll move the right direction. I'm not waiting for that. I'm going to assume the more conservative approach on things, so that way if it's less conservative than that, great, that gives us the extra room. And I do know, as you mentioned, there's companies that are going to be pushing up on their 8 weeks pretty soon here. So if you haven't started calculating and tracking and putting that file together, go back and do it. If nothing else, you want to see where you're at. And that's right. One of the nice things about as you're going tracking mechanism, you can see how you progress towards that, and then adjustments can be made if needed halfway through or most of the way through. And of course, you still got to be careful. I hear a lot of questions about that relate to people over 100,000. I think the number is 15,385. That's your max.
Yeah.
If that person is if that person's over that, if you're paying them more than that, it's not going to count towards the forgiveness. So you got to be careful not to throw that in. I heard that question actually quite a bit in the last 2 or 3 weeks from business owners, and you just need to be careful that you don't think that that's going to be part of your cost forgiven.
Thanks, Mike, for all your wisdom on the PPP loan program and what we know today. I know it's extremely frustrating and stressful that we don't have the guidance yet, but as we continue to read more in the news, hear about what's going on in Congress, hopefully that the SBA actually submits something soon, we'll keep you updated so that you're as well educated as we are on what you can do from the loan perspective and loan forgiveness. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next lunch.